Thing you need to do to color grade is if you already don't have the color grading panel open, how you do this is in the top right corner, you click on this little workspace panel and then you go down to the option that's on color. Now it's going to bring up this pop-up panel like so, and from here we've got a couple different options to color grade. Now you can either click on the auto feature, which color grades your clips fast as possible. It doesn't look that good most of the time when there's not an apparent difference. But if you're here to learn more how to color grade, first up is basic correction. Now basic correction is basically the essential settings to color grading. We've got exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, and these are the 6 most settings that I use and any professional color graders use to color grade their shots. Now the first thing is exposure. As you can see, the shot is very dark, so we like to crank this up just a little bit. Now not too much, but just so you can see a lot more of the whites and more of the details. Those brighter shots are typically more visually appealing to the human eye, and we'll be able to fix this later because it's currently a little bit bright. So the next thing I like to do is I just go down to shadows, and I like to give these down quite a bit because as you can see, it draws out the more of the individualized detail, and also crank down the highlights. Now this is going to remove some of the color, but I like to combat this with a little bit more contrast. The contrast is basically the same as exposure. It adds a lot more light to the image, and you can see a lot more of the lines and small details in this image. And I'm just going to crank up the exposure a little bit because I don't want this to be a really dark shot. Now the next thing I like to do is I like to crank up the highlights. Now the highlights are essentially the same as exposure. They add a lot more color and lighting to the image, which contrast and highlights sort of work together. You can mess around with this. As you can see, it just highlights more of the individualized colors. And then we've got whites and blacks. Now whites and blacks are basically the whites and blacks of the image. As you can see, when we crank up the whites or blacks, I'm going to crank these down a little bit for this image because it's a lot easier to see the individualized pixels on this image of all the small details. And I'm also going to turn up the temperature just a little bit. Now you can get a LUT, which is basically a filter for color grading when you're shooting your video completely raw, but in this case I'm just going to turn up the temperature because I want to go for a certain vivid, warmer feel of this video. Just put it at -7, and then I'm just going to turn up the saturation so you can get more of a sense of what kind of colors we're dealing with in this image. Now saturation, you can turn it down all the way to make it down black and white, or you can turn it up just a little bit so that you can bring out more of the colors in this image. Now this is a little bit too much. I'm just going to leave it at around 120, slightly above 100. Then I'm just going to go down to creatives. Now creatives are basically just giving this clip a sort of filter almost to it, because as you can see, we can add faded film. This gives it more of an individualized feel. You can make it soft if you don't want it to be as apparent in certain subjects to draw attention overall. In this case, I'm just going to leave this at 0. You can just double tap on this to actually move it back to 0. We can turn up the vibrance just a little. As you can see, the buildings are a lot more colorful. Exact grade I'm going for, so I'm just going to turn this down, the saturation down just a little bit. However, this isn't exactly what I'm going for, so I'm just going to turn up the saturation just a little bit, but leave the vibrance up a little. Then I like to go down to curves. Now curves is basically, this is the best way to adjust the individualized lighting of the entire video clip you're dealing with. How you do this is you can click on this and it creates like little keyframes, and you can actually drag these up and down. As you can see, if you drag it too much or too little, it will actually change certain parts of this clip. In this case, I'm just going to crank it up a little, and you can drag this one down here too. Usually you don't want to move these too fast or too far down, because if you do, as you can see, it just like oversaturates the entire image. So I'm just going to do this a little bit of curves, cranking these up a little bit. I recommend doing 3 dots. As you can see, there's a little grid here, and that makes it a lot easier to understand. Then from here, I like to go down to curves. Now curves is basically how you adjust the overall colors of certain lighting in the clip you're dealing with. As you can see, we've got a bar graph right here, and you just want to click on this 3 points right here. As you can see, there's an axis, and you can drag down these little points a little bit and actually change the color of the whites in this image. In this case, we've selected whites right here. So I'm just going to turn that up a little bit. As you can see, the sky is a little bit more vibrant and the whites in the image overall. But if you turn this up too much, it will oversaturate the image, or if you move it too far down. So I'm just going to move this a little bit up. Then we can click on reds right here. And as you can see, we can see our white graph right here, but I'm just going to again create 3 points and turn up the reds just a little bit. Now not too much, just because it's a video clip, I don't want the reds to be too apparent. Then from here, I like to go down to hue versus stat. Now this is basically how you can adjust the colors in the clip overall. As you can see, it gives more of a red feel. You can mess around with this, or if you move it down all the way to the bottom, it makes it black and white. So in this case, I'm just going to crank it up a little bit because we don't want to go too crazy for that. And then you want to go down here, and then you want to go to click on HLS secondary. Now, HLS secondary is one of my favorite settings when it comes to color grading. As you can see, this is what the panel looks like. And so how you do this is you click on the little eyedropper tool. And then once you're selected the eyedropper tool, you just select some very dull sort of color. In this case, I'm going to choose the gray buildings. You click on it, and as you can see, you scroll down here and you can actually increase the saturation for what you've just selected. As you can see, all the grays are increasing. It's not very apparent, but if we go back up here and click on it again, we can choose red, for example, and then scroll back down here and actually crank up the saturation once again. As you can see, the reds are a lot more vibrant in this image now. And I'm also going to turn up the temperature just a little bit so we can get more of that warm feel. Then from here, what I typically like to do is I like to close out of HLS secondary and actually go over here to lumetri scopes, which basically is how you can see scientifically how Premiere thinks your image looks overall. As you can see, there's this graph over here. How you open it, if you do not have it open, you right click and you can actually choose on waveform. And once you click on that, it will open this graph right here. But what this basically means is your goal is to basically have all your colors, all these random little colors right here, around the 50% line. As you can see, we've got some near 0, but none near 100. The some near 0 means something's wrong and I should probably increase something. In this case, I'm just going to mess around. As you can see, when I increase my shadows, these move towards the middle, but if I increase my exposure too much, all the lines move to the top, and if I decrease it all the way, all the lines move to the bottom. But in this case, I like how it's shaping up so far, so I'm just going to increase the exposure just a little bit so that we get a little bit of a brighter image overall, and maybe change up the temperature just a little bit so it's a little bit more vibrant. Finally, we have the vignette, which the vignette is basically how you add borders to this image. In this case, if I increase my vignette towards the right, it will add a white sort of border around this image. If I decrease it all the way, it's sort of a black border. And this basically just allows you to draw more focus to the center of your image. In this case, I want to add a feather, which basically is how much the vignette gradually grows throughout this image. In this case, I don't want it to be too apparent, like this is super obvious, but I want it to be a little bit above average, and then have my vignette be a little black so that the main focus of the image is again these colorful buildings right here. And then finally, how you see your before and after results of this image is you just click on this little FX button right here, click on it. As you can see, this was the before, and if you click on it again, this is the after. But if you found this video helpful, share this video with a friend who also needs to up their color grading game.